I'm recording today's presentation. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation when we stop the recording. If you have questions in between, please feel free to enter that into the chat box. I'll do my best to answer throughout the presentation. Good morning and welcome to the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Security's weekly webinar called Midweek Money Matters. Today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and holiday shopping tips because 2 out of 3 shoppers plan to do most of their holiday shopping in 2020. That number is up significantly compared to last year. And, the reality is that's, probably due to the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So as we take a look at this statistic that comes from creditcards.com, it's important that we talk about how can we do this safely and securely. So we are going to be talking today. We're going to talk, first we'll talk general cybersecurity preparedness. Midweek Money Matters events are 30-minute presentations, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about cybersecurity preparedness in general, but I do want to make sure that I kind of go over these top 4 things that we need to make sure that we keep in mind. And that is that we have to make sure that our browsers, our applications, and our operating systems are all current and up to date. And if you're not sure how to do that, I would encourage you to open your favorite web browser and type in updating my browser. You can go into your settings on your computer and make sure that that is also current and up to date. The reason we encourage consumers to keep everything up to date is because often when updates are issued, it's because the program itself has found ways that the information may be compromised. So it's critical that we keep everything up to date so that it maintains the strong integrity of the system. It fixes any security threats that may have been found. The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we use strong passwords. And when I say strong passwords, it's important that it's at least 8 characters. Most people say it should be more than 15 characters. But it needs to be, our passwords need to be a combination of upper and lower, where you can substitute in symbols instead of numbers, maybe, or letters, maybe use the @ sign instead of the letter A. Those types of things make it much more difficult for computers to guess our passwords, because unfortunately the reality is that there are computer programs that are dedicated to trying to get into consumers' accounts, and they actually will just spend time trying to figure out what your password is. So it's important that we have strong passwords. And it's critical that we use separate passwords for all of our different logins. And I know that's a lot to remember, but the reality is if we use the same passwords or the same few passwords, we're going to end up having those passwords compromised when that computer that I mentioned figures out those passwords. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't encourage us all to make sure that our virus protection is installed and up to date as well. So if you don't have virus protection, make sure you get it and keep it up to date like you do the other applications and operating systems. Okay, so on to the fun stuff. Today we're going to be talking about 4 major things as far as cybersecurity tips for holiday shopping. We're going to talk about researching, comparing sites, and policies. We'll talk about how we should pay, and finally, the types of records that we need to keep and why we need to do those things. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are researching the website. I am on social media, and I'm always getting these, t-shirt, here's this really great t-shirt that you should buy, and it comes through my social media feed. And when I look at the company and I search the name of the company in my favorite web browser, what I find, unfortunately, is that oftentimes the company itself is not necessarily that legitimate. So when I type in the name of the company into my favorite search engine and I type reviews, it's amazing the information that I can find. I am getting some feedback. So if everyone could please make sure that your microphones are muted while we go through today's presentation, that would be fantastic. But it's amazing the types of things that we can find about companies when we search that word review. And sometimes I even go so far as to search the word scams, because there are many, many companies out there that create websites that look really fantastic, but the only thing they're doing is trying to gather our personal information so that they can use it to their advantage. So it's important that we research the website. And we also need to make sure, and we'll spend more time talking about this, but we want to make sure that the website we're using, when we put our personal information in, is using a secured site. So we want to look at that HTTPS in the browser address. So those are some things that we really need to make sure that we do. You can also go to bbb.org, and you can check for reviews about a company from the Better Business Bureau. They have some great resources as well. And then you want to make sure that you are comparing policies, and making sure that there's a price match guarantee or comparing prices is important. However, you also have to make sure that you're comfortable with the terms and conditions and the privacy policies that those companies have. And when we're looking at terms and conditions, that can become incredibly daunting. It's that 15-page legalese contract information that is printed in a micro-size print font, but it's important that we're comfortable with what that company is doing with our personal information. And make sure that we understand what their policies are. Do they allow for returns? I purchased a handbag last year before I went on vacation, and when I got it, it took me about 2 weeks to open the package, but the zippers didn't work properly, and the return policy for that particular company was that it had to be returned within 10 days. And I was beyond that. So had I taken my own advice and looked at those terms and conditions, I would have understood that I needed to either reconsider buying from that company, or B, I needed to make sure that I opened that package right away and made sure that everything was as I expected. So that's what I mean when I talk about comparing policies. We want to make sure that we have the ability to return those things, and that we're comfortable with some of those policies and how they're protecting our personal information. So back to when we go to add our personal or payment information, our shipping address, that's our home address typically. That payment information, if someone gets a hold of that information, it can cause a lot of financial harm. So it's very important that we're using a secured website. So as I mentioned, we want to look at that HTTPS. And then we also want to take a look at the certificates that the how we are having our information protected. So before we put our personal information in there, we want to make sure that we're looking at that HTTPS in the web address. That is vitally important. You wouldn't just put your personal information out there for anyone to see, if you're not putting your information into a secured website, other people who are also using the internet and are clearly much smarter than I am when it comes to internet, but when we're putting that information in there, they can be capturing that information and then they can use it for their advantage. So let's talk about payments. This becomes one of those things that, I'm really not supposed to say that you should pay with your credit card. But the reality is, if I use my credit card, if I use my debit card and it's compromised, it may be a few days before I get that money back into my account. And if I'm relying on cash flow from that account, I need to make sure that I have resources, because the reality is that when you contest an unauthorized transaction, it can take a couple of days before you get that provisional credit. And if you rely on getting into your, rely on having cash flow from your bank, that can be a risk. So paying with a credit card can be very helpful, but you need to make sure that you pay that off as soon as you can so you avoid paying those interest fees. The other thing that you can do is you can request from your financial institution what's called a single-use card number. It's getting easier and easier to be able to request that from your financial institution. And that information, it's basically like a disposable credit card number. If I'm making a big purchase on, xyz.com, I can get that single-use card number, put that information in. It's only going to work that one time. And then I know that my finances are safe and secure through my institution still. Another option is to pay with a prepaid card. Many of those are reloadable, and they can, you can keep just enough on there to cover what you're planning to spend while you're shopping online. And that, again, is another great way to be able to protect that personal information that you have, that you have to put in as you're shopping online. So the last type of payment that I want to talk about are third-party payment options. And that's Apple Pay and PayPal, those are both third-party payment options. And basically they are an intermediary between you and the company that you want to shop from. By paying with PayPal or Apple Pay, you can be able to keep your payment information more secure by using that third party. So that's something to consider. And the other thing that's really great about using those third party payments is that those companies are often licensed by my office. And if you have a problem with that, you can contact us and we may be able to help you at least understand what is happening with your, with the account. So that can be very helpful as well. So as we're shopping, it's important that we keep track of that information. We want to keep the receipts and we want to keep the emails that we get from the companies. Particularly if you're shopping significantly and you're expecting multiple packages, it can be easy to forget that you're expecting something. And if it doesn't show up, if you're not remembering, you may not get what you've ordered, and it may be a while until you realize that it hasn't come. So keeping those receipts and emails can go a long way in making sure that you get what you pay for. And, as you start to receive your packages, you can maybe decide to delete the emails with the tracking information. But you always want to make sure that you keep your receipts, because you need to compare that to what actually came out of your account. Unfortunately, sometimes less reputable companies, or even companies that are reputable, but maybe they accidentally withdraw something twice, or maybe you pay for something and you don't get credit for it. So making sure that you compare those receipts to what actually came out of the account is really important. And you have to make sure that you check those statements every month that come in, and you want to make sure you look through them very carefully, because if there's an unauthorized transaction, you only have a defined amount of time to report it to the company. It's typically 60 days, but it really is dependent on the company's policy. I've heard that there are companies that will take the report up to a year out. But make sure that you know the policy for your institution, and make sure you keep track of that. So if you find something that's not quite right, one of the first things you want to do is make sure that you contact the company and get clarification for what happened. If you don't think it's right, ask them to make an adjustment. That's going to be your quickest way to resolve it. But while you're doing that, you want to make sure that you keep track of who you talk to and what people say. I had a transaction that didn't post to an account actually just this week. And the person that I spoke to called me back and let me know that the problem had been resolved. But if it hadn't, I would have had all the information that I needed to call the company back and say, on Monday, this is what we talked about, and this is what you were supposed to do. And I'd like an update. And then if it's not resolved to your satisfaction, you want to make sure that you report it to your financial institution. And as I said in the previous slide, it's critical that you report that in a timely manner, because that is a time-sensitive issue. So you want to make sure that you get that reported in that timely fashion. So we've all had that strange unauthorized transaction. The more we shop online, the reality is these things happen, and it's, I almost feel like it's inevitable. I feel like it's not a matter of if it's going to happen; it's just a matter of when. My in-laws actually called me just last month. They had a transaction for $1.49 that they didn't recognize, and they wanted to know what they should do. So I told them they had to make sure they notified that financial institution. The cards were canceled, and they got their money back. But when they notified the financial institution, they actually found that that was set up as a recurring transaction. And I suspect it wouldn't have continued to be $1.49. That amount that they would have taken out would have increased. And had they not stayed on top of it, they could have been out significant amounts of money. Once you've done that, you need to make sure that you file the police reports with the appropriate organizations. And unfortunately, it's critical that we report it to all three of these organizations. So you want to make sure you report it to your local police, because they understand what's happening right in your community. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office has jurisdiction over the whole state, and they'll see trends that are happening within the Commonwealth. And the last organization you want to make sure you report to is the Federal Trade Commission, because they have jurisdiction over the whole United States, and they actually share information with several other law enforcement type agencies. So it's important that we report to all three. And I will be providing those resources in the next few slides, so you can have the websites for those places. One thing you also want to make sure that you do is you need to make sure that you keep a notebook. In one of the previous slides, I suggested that keeping notes and keeping track of who you talk to is important. If your card is compromised, it's important to keep a notebook. That can go a really long way in helping you to remember what happened. I'm on a small group of consumer protection organizations out of Philadelphia, and I recently heard, well, not recently, it's been over a year, but the Postal Inspection Service had received information from the Federal Trade Commission about a string of identity thefts that had been happening in Philadelphia and New Jersey. And the reality was, the postal inspector was investigating and reaching out to hundreds of consumers who had been victims 5 years before. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't remember what I did 5 months ago, let alone what I did 5 years ago. So keeping that notebook and keeping track of who you talk to and any mail correspondence becomes really important for investigators when they're trying to figure out what's going on with a crime. So the last thing I would encourage everyone to do, and you should do this whether your card is compromised or not, you need to check your credit report at annualcreditreport.com. That's the only place that's mandated by the federal government that you have access to your credit report once a year. The great thing is that while we're in the midst of this pandemic, each of the 3 credit reporting bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, and I'm drawing a blank. Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian are actually providing access to each of those credit reports once a week. So that goes a really long way in making sure that everything on our credit report is true and accurate. And if you find information that's not right, it's really important that you notify the credit reporting bureaus about those inconsistencies. And as you check those credit reports, you'll find the information on the website on how to contest that information. So I mentioned Pennsylvania resources. So you can learn more information about today's presentation and many other resources on my website, the Department of Banking and Securities at dobs.pa.gov. If you're a victim of a fraud or scam, you can report that to the Attorney General at attorneygeneral.gov. And the Postal Inspection Service that I had mentioned, if your question involves the mail or you become a victim of a fraud or scam that involves the mail, USPS.gov is a great resource. And then I mentioned that you need to report identity theft and scams to the Federal Trade Commission. You can do that at consumer.ftc.gov. Those are all really fantastic resources for Pennsylvania and the federal government. So I would encourage you to make sure that you keep track of this and know how to report that information. Now, after today's presentation, I am going to provide my email address. If you would like to have a copy of today's PowerPoint, I'm happy to send that out to you. You can email me and I'll get it sent out to you right away. The state of Pennsylvania has a really great cybersecurity protection guide that you can go to pa.gov/cybersecurity. The reality is I could talk about shopping online safely for hours, if not days. But it's too much information to try to cover in 30 minutes. So I always want to share other resources. And this guide is actually very well done. There are a team of about 15 of us that work to try to ensure that this information stays current and accurate. So check that out and you can learn lots more about cybersecurity on that website. So speaking of assistance, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our Office of Consumer Services are available to help consumers understand what's happening with their financial accounts. They can answer questions about what's happening with your financial institution. If you're having issues with your mortgage or car payments, or you've got questions about your investment professionals, you can reach that staff at 800 PA Banks. They are open regular business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And what I think is one of my favorite things about the department is that we think it's very important for consumers to be able to reach us. So there are no menu options. There's no one for this or two for that. A real live person will answer your call, or you'll be asked to leave a message, and one of our staff will be happy to return your call within 24 business hours. So that call and our services are all free. So I would encourage you to contact them if you have questions or concerns, that they can, if they can't help you, they can point you in the right direction, which goes a long way in getting us the help that we need. So speaking of getting help and asking questions,